So hello everyone and welcome to this webinar, which is hosted by the University of Graz ELT Research and Methodology team and the Faculty of Humanities Teaching and Learning Center. My name is Achilleas Kostoulas and it is a great privilege to welcome tonight Ulrike Pavelka from King's College London.
Hi.
Now, Ulrike is a lecturer in German and she is also the team leader for, let me just get this right, it is German, Dutch, Swedish, Spanish and British Sign Language at the Modern Language Center at King's. Now, in tonight's webinar, Ulrike has kindly agreed to share with us her insights about how to encourage learner autonomy and how to deal with language classrooms that are made up of students who have very diverse interests and diverse skills and needs. So it's promising to be a very interesting webinar, and thank you very much for joining us. Ulrike, over to you.
Thank you for having me. Yes, as already mentioned, my name is Ulrike Pavelka, and I welcome you to this webinar about learner autonomy and heterogeneity. In this presentation, I have tried to put my teaching experience of the last 10 years with learner autonomy and heterogeneity into a mind map, and the result is this crazy. If you're really interested in reading a bit more after this presentation, I have also put together a list with some links which I can send to you. But yeah, let's get started on our presentation. Every learner has their individual learning background and individual ideas of what they want to achieve in class. And as teachers, we are therefore continuously confronted with heterogeneous groups. The webinar will explore how learner autonomy and internal differentiation can help us to take different backgrounds into account and how to encourage students to take control over their learning process. In the first part of this webinar, we will discuss what autonomous learning means. And in the second part, I would like to look at heterogeneity and focus on methods to introduce internal differentiation in class. We can say a learner who's working autonomously is able to determine time, place, and rhythm when learning, is able to take responsibility, and able to steer and reflect the learning process. Let's take a look at the first bit here. So when we want to determine time, place, and rhythm ourselves when we are learning, then we need a certain environment. And in this environment, the teacher, rather than being the presenter of knowledge, is actually an advisor and facilitator. And as the facilitator, the teacher has to decide when to stimulate autonomous learning. It's also the teacher's job to create situations and the space to learn autonomously. Another thing, as just mentioned, is that the student is able to take responsibility over their learning process. And how do they do that? They do that by steering and reflecting on the learning process. How do we get there? Well, when I plan a lesson, I usually set certain can-do descriptors for my students that they should achieve. These can-do descriptors are usually representing a language aspect. For example, I am able to buy food at the market. But these targets can also be transferred to autonomous learning, and I have created 3 of them. The first one is that my learners are able to set their own learning targets. And in order to get there, obviously you need certain activities. So some examples for this could be, number 1, to show your your own goals and targets, so that you share your learning targets with your students. In this way, they will get used to think in targets, and they will also understand when they have achieved it. This has the great side effect of obviously also having more motivated students because they understand what's going on. In the second step, you could start creating learning targets with your students, and you start with small steps. For example, after a test, you could ask your students to write down targets they have now that they've done a test, and it could be, for example, I would like to revise irregular past tenses. It is important to keep in mind that targets should be clearly defined and that you should always be able to measure it. To give you an example, a target such as I want to speak better is quite difficult to reach, whereas the target I want to be able to buy food at the market is clearly defined and you can measure the success as you either manage or fail to buy what you wanted to buy. In the next step, you could analyze your textbook. Many textbooks these days have very clear can-do statements integrated either at the beginning of the book or after each chapter. And it is well worthwhile using that information and that work that has already been provided for you. And I think once you've done these things and your students are used to defining their own targets, you can start negotiating them in class. Students will be interested because they have defined themselves what is important to them, and at the same time they have taken the responsibility to think about what they actually need. So by doing these steps, you should be able to get your learners to think about their own learning targets and how to reach them. The second aim that is relevant in this context is that your learners are able to reflect study techniques and learning strategies. In class, you can, for example, do a test on learning styles. You can let your students evaluate exercises and tasks, and this should help them to understand what kind of exercises is especially helpful or effective. I have mentioned here the mood barometer, so this is a very easy thing of you did some kind of exercise, let's say writing a text in groups, and you just quickly let students hold up a smiley how they feel about this exercise, gives you feedback how it worked, but also encourages students themselves to think about what they actually felt about this. But there are obviously lots and lots of different exercises to evaluate tasks. Another thing that is very helpful is to compare and discuss learning strategies. You shouldn't underestimate how much experience your students already bring with them and how eager or happy they are to share what they have done so far. I have made, it worked really well for me when I asked students what kind of strategies they use when they learn articles in German for their Adidas, or what kind of technique to use to memorize irregular past tense forms. And I think it works well because it comes from the peers and not just always from the professional. Of course, it doesn't mean that that would be excluded. So now your students can set their targets. They know which learning strategies work for them. The third target would be that students are able to evaluate themselves. In class, you can, for example, introduce a checklist, which includes I can do this, I still need time for that. It's usually quite good to keep them as positive as possible, to keep motivation going. Many textbooks do actually also provide checklists these days. Another good thing would be to encourage your students to correct exercises in the textbooks themselves. Again, in many cases, the solutions are provided. Still, it is surprising that many students don't realize that there are solutions in the back of the book, or that they might need some guidance on how to actually correct themselves and to understand what the mistake might have been. What I like particularly about this encouragement of students correcting their own exercises is that it frees up time in class to focus on exactly those points that they had problems with, instead of going through all the exercises together. They know everything, and so yeah, I think to be able to focus on things that have created problems, it is good to have time for that. So we can say that students will act autonomously when they take the responsibility over the learning process by determining time, place, and rhythm of learning, and by actively steering and reflecting their learning experience. So I would like to move on to the second part of this presentation. As you will all have experienced, students have quite different needs and wishes. And this is why internal differentiation of learner groups is so important. But as you're probably also aware, internal differentiation is a complex process and it's quite labor intensive. And this is why I would like to emphasize, while we are going to look at quite a big range of techniques and possible things you can do, I would recommend that you focus on one or two, especially in the beginning. I personally found that the most effective way of differentiating for me was to have different types of interaction in my classes. But we will come back to all these different techniques later, because our main question is obviously, I was going up instead of further. What kind of support we are supposed to give. And in order to answer that, we need to know where the heterogeneity comes from. And we will see that our students have different learning speeds, they have varying capacity of taking in things, they will have different reasons why they learn a language, and they will have a quite broad range of interests. So here they are again: learning speed, learning capacity, motivation, and interest. And this, for example, depends on the previous education. So one question would be, do my students speak any other languages? Students who have never learned another language might not actually be aware of the meta-language that is often used in the classroom. For example, they might not know what a verb is. And so they might feel extremely insecure when you start explaining grammar in an abstract way. Students who have already learned other languages, on the other hand, they might bring a higher linguistic awareness, but at the same time, they might be surprised at things that they didn't expect. As an example, an Italian native speaker who learned Spanish might think it's quite easy to learn a language, but then realizes how much more challenging it is to do Russian or German. Another thing you should always ask yourself is whether, or actually should ask your students, whether they have learned a language in school previously. It is very likely, and it also means that they come with certain expectations. It might mean, for example, that they perceive progress mainly as something that is learning rules or filling in exercises, and they don't feel they do any progress if you do a lot of speaking practice in class. Others might expect that content is presented to them, and then they will find it difficult to participate actively. And also you should keep in mind that learning traditions in different countries or cultures might be quite different. My experience, for example, is I would like all my students to be able to speak in front of the class and not to mind if there's any mistakes, but some students might not be used to this kind of exposure and not really like to participate in activities like that. Heterogeneity also means that you have different learning styles. I have already mentioned them in our first part of the presentation, and a learner will usually have one main learning style or maybe a combination of them. Combination is more common. And as a teacher, it is quite important to be aware of the different learning styles and to vary tasks in class accordingly, so that all students have the opportunity to be stimulated and challenged the right way. The very well-known learning styles are visual, oral, verbal, physical, logical. Less well-known is, for example, learners who prefer to study in a social or solitary way. And I've also read up on quite different approaches to learning styles, also very interesting. I think as a teacher you should be aware of different learning styles, but also your learners should make themselves aware. And they should obviously know what works best for them, and at the same time train with learning styles that they're not so used to. And last but not least, heterogeneity is related to what students are interested in. Are they studying the language because they're looking for a job? Are they in love with somebody and want to be able to speak to the family of the loved one? Do they have an interest in the culture of the country? And all this will determine the topics they want to engage in and the kind of text they want to work with. For example, somebody learning the language in a work context aims to understand job adverts, CVs, maybe even a legal document. Somebody interested in the culture might want to read biographies and understand documentaries. And somebody who's moving to the country soon might be especially interested in day-to-day conversation and therefore want to read and use a dialogue. So all these students are sitting in one class. And that's why we need heterogeneity, that's why we need exercises and tasks and techniques how to deal with these different interests, these different learning styles and the different education and backgrounds. I have thought of which areas can be particularly practical to introduce internal differentiation. And you can see here steering and support, topics, type of exercises, the complexity of the exercises, quantity, and working independently. So these are the areas that I found lean themselves towards differentiation. And I have also created activities that relate to one or more of these areas. And yes, please keep in mind, nobody would be able to do all these activities at all times. Try to focus on one or two, and already it will make quite a difference when you are teaching. Let's start with steering and support. So if you're in the happy situation to do team teaching, this is one of the great ways to support and steer individually. Individual support is obviously practical when a student would need more time to finish a task. This is what we usually do. But it is also possible to think of it in a way that you split the group into interest, for example. So one is interested in work related, the other one is more like love related. And you work on different topics at the same time. Help and support can also be easily provided by giving individual homework. For example, you could categorize your homework by difficulty, and let's call them A, B, and C. Students then can choose themselves which worksheet they want to take home. This could be according to how secure they feel with the topic, but it could also be how much time they have this week, or if they have the feeling they have to review something. So this would allow students at home, at their own time, to work quite individually. For you, it would mean more preparation time to hand out the homework, but actually correcting it would be the same, because it doesn't matter if everybody sends in the same worksheet or different ones. Or, even better, you provide the solutions, and students check themselves and only come with questions. Steering and support. Steering is important when it comes to the type of interaction. So are you working alone? Are you working in pairs? Are you working in groups? And here it's important not only to change the type of interaction, but also who is in those groups. So having always the same two people work together just because they happen to sit next to each other is not always conducive for autonomous learning or for developing different skills. I think it makes sense to pair people or put people in groups according to what you want to achieve. Sometimes it makes sense to pair up weaker students and stronger students so that they can challenge each other. Or you will have students who are very strong in speaking and others who are very strong in grammar, and to pair up those. But sometimes it also makes sense to pair two weaker students and two stronger students, because it means that the weaker students can take their time and the stronger students can advance at a quicker pace. So it really takes, you need to know your students, but once you do, grouping them in these ways allows them to explore different areas and to work in different speeds, and also not only being able to advance at a quick pace, but maybe to be able to explain something to somebody. So I think you get a lot of different abilities out of students by changing the interaction. Another way to differentiating classes by the topic. You can see the topic is related to the individual homework, but it's also related to learning at stations. And now learning at stations is great because you will be able to differentiate by topic and type, and you can give individual support. It needs a lot of preparation time. But there is quite a lot of useful literature as well. Sometimes you're lucky and you find things that have already been prepared for you around a certain topic, maybe a grammar revision or something content related. And if it is well planned, then the students will work in a very concentrated way. They're going to be engaged, and you have enough time to look after individual participants. So yes, I can definitely recommend that you give it a try. When we take into account the complexity, so we now see type and complexity, then we can create tasks for different learning types or learning styles, such as, for example, working with cards, or working with role plays, or working with movement. And that means that so that you don't always introduce everything the same way, but do actively remember that you've used cards 3 times, so maybe now it's time to go into the movement so that other students also get something out of it, or that all your students explore the different abilities of learning and learning styles. We can also create worksheets with different tasks. This is also something that might be a bit more work in the beginning, but becomes somehow second nature when you start creating worksheets like that. It could mean that you have different tasks for different people. So on the one hand, it could be that you have additional tasks when you know that somebody is going to take probably less time than others to finish filling in the past tenses. You just add another 1 or 2 exercises which become a bit more difficult, but it doesn't matter if not all of the students finish all the tasks. And another option is to vary your worksheets, and so some students have an easier task and others have a more difficult task. So you could have closed questions as opposed to open questions, or you could just have a few gaps as opposed to many gaps. I find the additional tasks is probably the more efficient way of dealing with it, but it's obviously also really nice to provide different exercises on the same text. Which is obviously also related to the quantity. When it comes to choosing your task, on the one hand, it makes sense that you as a teacher guide your students, that you encourage them to maybe go for this one or that one. But I think you can also encourage them to choose for themselves, which obviously implies that they are able to judge what they're able to do, and also to read carefully what is actually expected of them. And what you can do to encourage this kind of coming forward themselves, or also to train how to understand your capacity, is that you as a teacher set a certain time frame, and then let the students choose how many tasks they want to finish within this time frame. So you can say, do 1 and take your time, or do 3 and do them quickly. Another thing could be that you say, do you feel like you want to train your reading, or you want to do your grammar, and give them the possibility to do either or, depending on what they want to emphasize on today. And again, it would make sense that you encourage your students to check and evaluate the answers themselves, because it frees up your time, and it also makes them work more independently. And as you might have guessed, this actually leads us in a certain direction: learner autonomy. If your students know how to set targets, If they are aware of the learning process and if they're happy to be involved in choosing topics, this will make it easier for you to work with heterogeneity. At the same time, many of the tasks that I just mentioned will actually help you to support the autonomous learning. The circle is hereby closed, and we can go into question and answering. I know it was quite a short presentation, but I hope you might have some questions for me. So I'm closing my presentation. And yes, I'm giving over to Achilles. I can't hear you at the moment.
But now you can. So thank you for this. Thank you for this, Ulrike. It was very, very interesting. I really enjoyed it. I have a couple of questions, but before I go into my questions, I was wondering if there's anyone in the audience, Jeremy, Sarah, or Thomas, who might want to weigh in, or if they have any remarks or questions. Can you just type them in the chat box? Or should I just go ahead with my question then? So I was wondering, you mentioned towards the beginning of your talk that one of the ways in which you can engage the students is to start by setting some can-do statements, right? Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, to what extent might it be possible to also engage the students in this process? Are those can-do statements something that you set, or is there space for allowing the students to participate in that as well?
I think there would definitely be space for the students to participate in that. I think I always start with setting my statements, and I think, I would say sharing this goal with students as well, saying like, it's not just a goal that you can speak to somebody or that you can write a letter. It's also a goal that you learn how to learn, that you learn how to work autonomously, definitely. And to also make space in the classroom to discuss what does autonomous learning mean for you. Have you any experience with that, or are there other areas in your life where you learn things autonomously? Definitely, I think that would make a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you, that's great. Might there be any other questions from the other participants, perhaps?
So the question is,
have you ever experienced any resistance to autonomy approaches by students? A question by Sarah.
I think whenever you try something, there might be some resistance, definitely. Also when you play a game with your students, or if you read a text in a way that they're not expecting it, it brings us back to where do the students come from. And so it's all about telling the student why you're doing it, involving them, like picking them up from where they come from. If you have the feeling that something you do in class doesn't work and students don't want to do it, then I would get feedback on, as I said, like, how do you feel about this? And they're like, oh, I don't like this at all. And you go like, okay, well, why don't you like it? What can I change so you feel that it's useful for you? So I would say for any kind of activity you do or any kind of approach you have, you also have to have a reason why you do it. If you yourself are not convinced to do it, then, and don't know why you are doing it, then you don't have anything to put against it. But if you say like, I think you will learn more effectively like that, then it probably will work. I hope this answers the question. So, yeah.
I think that sums it up very nicely.
Okay. Yeah, you're welcome.
I've got one more. I was wondering, when you were talking about things like assigning individual homework and those kinds of activities, is there a tension between promoting this kind of individuality and assessing students in a, shall we say, objective and fair way if they do different tasks?
Yeah, there is a difference in what kind of environment you do it. I first started doing this in a normal evening language class where students actually said, I want to do more of this, and they wanted to read more, so I started providing them with a story that they could read but didn't have to. And obviously, because the course is not assessed, it doesn't make a difference. What I do in my assessed modules is I have a section which is called obligatory homework, and then I have individual homework. And this is less assigning to people, you can do this, you can do that. It's more they themselves choose if they want to work more on top of that. I think, and I think insofar a student who puts in more effort and studies more will obviously have a better result. But because it's voluntary to do it, and I'm not forcing anybody to do the easy one, I don't think it has an impact on the assessment of the student. It's their own choice and their own involvement.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Yeah. Like maybe a question to my listeners: are any of you teachers, or are you students, or any experience you had with autonomous learning?
So Sarah says that she is a teacher and has tried to use autonomy-inspired approaches where possible within the bounds of institutional and curricular constraints.
I can imagine that when you have a lot of curricular constraints, it's not that easy to change the methods and introduce new things.
And it's always interesting to see the tension that exists between, or rather the scope of autonomy we have as teachers to work within these constraints.
Definitely, yeah. Yes, definitely. I'm just waiting for the next message to see.
And Tatiana says that I'm a teacher and sometimes my students just want to be in a comfort zone. They want to be teacher dependent and they want to just be guided, so they don't want autonomy. So that, I think, is also a very interesting comment, that there's sometimes resistance to that, to promoting autonomy, I guess.
And it's followed up by a question from Sarah that says, what do I see the relationship between the teacher and learner autonomy? And I think that's, I can understand that students are in a comfort zone. I think this is what I mentioned, when students come from a certain teaching style that they're used to, where they listen to the teacher and all they have to do is sit and listen and then fill in things, and then all of a sudden to have to decide yourself. It's not fun. It's awkward. You don't understand how it works. So I think that's why I think that you have to approach autonomous learning or all these different tasks exactly like you would do with reading. So your student can't read in German. What do? You have to know the vocabulary, you have to know structures, you have to guide them step by step. So I think your students, especially if they come from a certain background, they will not be able to decide these things in the first lesson. And that's why you should take these small steps and say, for 3 to 4 weeks, only show them what the goals are. And then only then say, like, maybe for today, the overall goal is this. What would you like to be able to know? And it's just like a communicative question, and they don't even notice that they're taking an autonomous decision. So I think I personally would try to take very small steps and integrate it into the language acquisition. Just a question in German, you answer in German, and it so happens to involve also some learning autonomy. And then by the end of the year, you could also look back and say, like, look, this year you have achieved to determine yourself what topic you want, or what kind of learning style you like. Another thing I like to do is, just this week I received some feedback from a class, and they said, oh, we didn't do enough business-oriented material in class. I'm teaching a business class. So I think, and my students come from school, they're not very much used to decide for these things for themselves. But for me, that's a really good point, and say, like, I got the feedback from you that you want more material. Do you have a suggestion for me? And hopefully they will come up with a suggestion, what kind of topic they would like to do, and they've taken an autonomous decision on what they're interested in. So this is, I think, how the teacher should guide the learner autonomy. Okay. We received a thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's one last question.
Mm-hmm.
How do you work? How do you work with students who have become fed up with reflection?
That's a good question.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think especially when it comes with a lot of feedback things. Yeah. So when you say reflection, do you mean the diary? Are you referring to a certain kind of reflection? Okay, so the reflection that Sarah was referring to, we have overused the term here in my workplace, and students have to reflect with diaries, but also on many experiences and tasks. Somehow they seem reflection weary, despite its sound pedagogical reasoning behind it. I agree, especially with diaries, they tend to get fed up with it. I found that with diaries, when I answered to the diaries, they would get less fed up with it. And in some cases, we would enter a really great dialogue with the students where they would answer to my, like, when they would do a reflection, I would answer them, and then they would reflect on that. I think one thing why students get fed up is because the diary is just for themselves and they don't get an outside input in it. And another one is I think it doesn't always have to be the diary. Maybe it's also we have to vary how we experience things. It could be, instead of writing down a long thing, it's just a short highlight where you just do a round of students and everybody just says one word that summarizes the day for them. So maybe that's where there needs to be some variation. And then there's another thing, one thing I read today, if you remember the different learning types I mentioned, and I mentioned the more classical approach, but I also read today, and I've put this link in the reading list, that there are different types of learners, such as observers, reflectors, but also activists, or I don't remember the actual names, but if your students are not the type of person who wants to reflect on things, but they want to have the method, or they want to be thrown into it and just try it, then this kind of reflection might just not suit the learning style. So it might be worthwhile taking into account that students not always want to reflect on everything, or not every week, and just do longer stretches in between them. Yeah, so Sarah says the dialogic, I don't even know how to pronounce it, dialogic approach. Yeah, I found that quite useful. Yeah. We can maybe have one last question if anybody has one last question, otherwise. Okay.
Great.
Cool.
So, thanks again, Ulrike, for being with us, and thank you everyone for joining us and for all your insightful questions and comments. Like I said, this webinar will be available for download in due course, and you can follow us in the Fach Didaktik Anglistik Facebook page for any updates. And one more thing, I'm also very happy to announce our next webinar. So Dr. Christina Gonlu from the University of Essex will be joining us next March to talk about how to deal with language learning anxiety. So we hope you can all join us on March the 7th. And until then, goodbye.
Goodbye.